Professor Glenn Diesen, thank you for joining us again on the mother of all talk shows. Let's start with, if we can, how we got here. Many people will be surprised that with NATO's many duties around the world, from the South China Sea to Colombia, that there's hundreds of them in a tiny protectorate, for that's what it is, called Kosovo, which is part of Serbia, and that they're there against the wishes of the Serbian government and people. Explain that conundrum, if you will.
Well, it's been well, first of all, let me say, yeah, good to see you again, George, and thank you for the kind introduction. This whole story began with NATO's illegal invasion of Yugoslavia in 1999. When they invaded without a UN mandate, because they argued that Chinese and Russians were threatening with a veto, which meant that they could override the United Nations. Also it's worth noting that even Henry Kissinger pointed out that NATO was looking for an excuse to bomb by effectively sabotaging their own peace accords with the Serbs. Anyways, after the invasion, NATO set up Kosovo more or less as a protectorate. They were able to get some legitimacy for it, though, by getting a UN mandate, which was 1244, and this was still what NATO refers to as its legality for being there. However, this mandate recognized the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia, which is now Serbia. But what happened over the next year, since 1999, was the Serbian population in Kosovo was largely ethnically cleansed. They were all pushed out, except for the north. In the north of Kosovo, it's still a Serb majority, and this has been what NATO sees as a challenge, because NATO then illegally recognized the independence of Kosovo in 2008. They still rely on the mandate 1244, which recognizes the territorial integrity of Serbia, but nonetheless, they have violated that mandate themselves. So anyways, over the next few years, the EU attempted to normalize relations between Serbia and Kosovo, which Serbia and the UN doesn't recognize as a state, which was in 2013. And this is part of the format was to have this community of Serbian municipalities in northern Kosovo. However, a decade later, the government in Pristina never implemented the agreement and has been trying to cement its control over the north, which of course the Serbs would fear. That brings us to the conflict we're currently at.
Exactly. You and I both know the Serbian people. When Djokovic wrote on the front of a television camera, Kosovo is the heart of Serbia, he meant it, and all Serbs mean it. They cannot possibly allow further dismemberment of what is now merely a rump of what once was Yugoslavia.
No, and that's also been part of the strange position of NATO, because the NATO forcefully took Kosovo from Serbia, which was the first time after the Second World War, we changed the European borders by force. But when we speak of the northern parts of Kosovo, the NATO countries have been quite opposed to allowing it to stay in Serbia. So they're suggesting that northern Kosovo secession from Kosovo is not permitted, even though technically they wouldn't actually secede because they're really a part of Serbia. So it's a big game of who's allowed to secede and who's not allowed. So it's a very strange and difficult game they're playing. It's effectively similar as what's happening in Bosnia.
Strange indeed. Strange indeed, though, Glenn. Let's as it were, pan out a bit. Who is allowed to secede and who is not allowed to secede? So Kosovo is allowed to secede, but Catalonia is not. And Crimea is not. How do Western politicians and your academic colleagues square that circle? Because it frankly sounds absurd to the ordinary person.
Yes, and well, it is absurd because what they effectively did was introduce this principle of self-determination, that this should be allowed to override territorial integrity. So now you've introduced two competing concepts. You have territorial integrity or self-determination. And well, which principle should work and or should it go with? And it turns out that, well, whatever power interests would dictate. So for example, in Kosovo, we need secession. In Crimea, no, it's territorial integrity. In Taiwan, they're pushing towards secession. So it's all very much, presenting two different competing concepts and then choosing the one that fits their interests. So people don't really appreciate how devastating this invasion was, because after the invasion of Yugoslavia in 1999, it was argued that it was illegal. It was not legal, but it was legitimate. And this is quite extraordinary, because this was when we decided to decouple legality from legitimacy. And one has to ask the question, and what makes something legitimate? Well, it turns out liberal democratic values. This is, again, a very vague reference to values. And who represents it? Well, it's the NATO countries, the US and its allies. So in other words, when making this claim, it's the West that gives itself a prerogative to create an exemption for itself in international law. So, we can interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. We can topple governments. We can invade. We can change borders, because now we are acting, according to liberal democratic values, which allows us to exempt us from the normal international law, which other countries have to follow. So whenever we talk about this rules-based international order, this is what we're talking about, this sovereign inequality between states, and it has its foundation in what was done in Kosovo.
Yes, which in turn flowed from the pen of Mr. Tony Blair and his Chicago Doctrine with his terrible twin, Bill Clinton. But here I'm detecting something that I'm going to dive more deeply into on another occasion, but it does seem to me that in the Yugoslav war and the breakup of Yugoslavia, the British were far more aggressive and determined on war than the Americans were. That Blair was more hawkish than Clinton. Ditto in the invasion of Libya, where Cameron and Sarkozy were quite a bit more gung-ho for war than the Obama-Biden administration. And now we're seeing all that repeated again in the Ukraine, where Biden says don't attack inside Russia. Britain says do attack inside Russia. It's perfectly legitimate to do so. In other words, maybe we need to recalibrate our fire on the US-UK relationship. Maybe the UK is actually perfidious Albion, is more close to the heart of these world problems than we perhaps assumed in the past.
Well, you're correct that there was Tony Blair who argued that, in this new era of liberal hegemony, he said we've moved beyond the Peace of Westphalia, which was, the recognition of sovereign equality of states. And his advisor, Cooper, who argued, we need the liberal empire again. We need to have a garden, protect the garden from the jungle. So again, going very back to this imperialist rhetoric. Now, but you're very correct though with this with the British. It's quite, for me, it's I'm not quite sure why the British becomes more hawkish than the United States. But it was also Tony Blair who, after the Serbian television criticized being bombed in 1999, he argued that this was war propaganda, which justified bombing the Serbian media. And of course, thereafter, the Americans bombed the Chinese embassy when they also complained. But we see also the same now in Ukraine. Of course, it's very strange that it's always Britain who comes out the hardest. They called for attacking inside Russia. They're the one who's sending depleted uranium ammunition. They're the ones sending the long range weapon systems. It's quite interesting that this is Britain on the front line.
Yes, it may be a sort of me cry now that we've left the European Union and we're desperate for attention. But on the other hand, it's placing British people in some danger and their interests in very grave danger. But as I say, I'm going to dive more deeply into that on another occasion. Back to Serbia for a minute, Professor. Where does this go now? Vučić has stood down as the leader of the ruling party in Serbia. There are elections. I think he's not going to contest them. There are big social movements on all kinds of things, family values, and the issue of mass shootings and so on. There are a lot of currents at play inside Serbia. No Serbian leadership can afford to sell out Kosovo, can they? Any more than they can afford to, for example, sanction Russia. No government could survive in Serbia that did either of these two things, let alone both of these two things.
No, I agree, and this is kind of the problem for Serbia. On one hand, no Serbian leader can surrender Kosovo. On the other hand, they don't want a war with NATO either. But in my opinion, if they're forced and pushed to a corner, I think that they would deploy military force if required to protect the Serbs in northern Kosovo. So it's my expectation, or how I see this, is that the Serbs will try. They have a strong incentive to walk this to soothe the tensions if it's possible. And I think that the benefit now is that it appears that NATO might that they also want to reduce tensions. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that over the past month the NATO countries have been quite responsible for provoking this, because for months now they've been putting immense pressure on Serbia to make concession on the Kosovo issue, and also to force Serbia, by the way, to put sanctions on Russia. Now, this is what the Serbian president has complained about for months as well, that they never experienced this amount of pressure before. And even the US ambassador to Serbia confirmed in March that the US was making Serbia, quote, pay a high price for its reluctance to impose sanctions on Russia. So the US committed itself to keeping up the pressure on Serbia. And there's been also many publications in the West that this is an opportunity now with the war in Ukraine, that they can put a split between the Serbs and the Russians as a condition for NATO to establish an exclusive sphere of influence in the Western Balkans. So the reason why this has contributed to this escalation is, how does the Kosovo Albanians react to this? Well, they saw that NATO has effectively given them unconditional support since 1999. And so now the authorities in Kosovo saw this as an opportunity to escalate, to cement their control over northern Kosovo. However, the Serbs in northern Kosovo pushed back, and Serbia put its military on high alert on the other side of the border. So what we're actually seeing now for the first time is NATO countries, then especially the United States and France, criticizing the government in Kosovo for having incited this conflict, and also now pressuring and punishing them in order to de-escalate. So again, this is something entirely new. So I don't see NATO wanting or can afford to make this escalate into a war. But again, they wanted to bring pain to the Serbs with max pressure. But now that NATO seemingly wants to de-escalate, it might be an opportunity if they're able to control Kosovo, that is, because the government there, they've had for the past, since 1999, they had effectively the assumption that NATO would defend them or support them no matter what. So they haven't really they've expected that they can get anything they want. So this is also a new situation for them, and it remains to be seen if they are willing to de-escalate.